Lady Margaret Whitmore had always been careful about her secrets. For 30 years she served as the Queen's personal secretary, managing correspondence, scheduling private meetings, and keeping the royal family's most sensitive information locked away in her memory. What nobody knew was that she had been writing everything down in a small leather diary, hidden behind false books in her apartment at Kensington Palace. The diary contained explosive details about royal affairs, secret meetings with foreign dignitaries, private arguments between family members, and financial dealings that would shock the public if they ever came to light. Margaret wrote in code, using initials and abbreviations that only she could understand. She never intended for anyone to read these pages, but the habit of recording everything had become second nature during her decades of service. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Margaret felt sharp chest pains while organizing the Queen's daily schedule. She collapsed at her desk, clutching the papers she had been reviewing. The palace medical team rushed to help, but it was too late. Lady Margaret Whitmore died of a massive heart attack at the age of 68, taking her secrets with her to the grave. The royal family mourned her passing privately. She had been more than an employee. She was a trusted confidant who knew where every skeleton was buried. Her funeral was attended by senior royals who spoke of her loyalty and discretion. Prince Charles himself gave a touching eulogy about her years of faithful service to the crown. What they didn't know was that Margaret's sister, Helen, had inherited her apartment along with all her belongings. Helen was a retired schoolteacher from Yorkshire, who rarely visited London and knew very little about royal protocol. She arrived at Kensington Palace 3 weeks after the funeral to pack up Margaret's personal items before the apartment was reassigned to another palace employee. Helen found the apartment exactly as Margaret had left it, with neat stacks of papers, carefully organized books, and personal mementos from her years of service. As she began packing the books, she noticed something odd about the bookshelf near the window. 3 books seemed to be glued together, and behind them was a small space containing a leather-bound diary. Opening the diary, Helen's eyes widened as she read the first few entries. Even though they were written in some kind of code, she could make out enough to understand that this contained sensitive information about the royal family. Names were abbreviated, but the context made it clear who Margaret was writing about. Helen realized she was holding something incredibly dangerous in her hands. She spent the next 2 days reading through the entire diary, slowly deciphering Margaret's code. The revelations were staggering. There were entries about secret loans to cover gambling debts, details about extramarital affairs that had been covered up, and information about behind-the-scenes political maneuvering that would embarrass the government if it became public. One entry particularly caught her attention. It described a heated argument between Prince Charles and his mother about a decision he wanted to make regarding the succession. Margaret had overheard the conversation and recorded Charles saying something that could be interpreted as questioning the Queen's judgment about the future of the monarchy. Helen knew she had stumbled upon something that could destroy careers and damage the royal family's reputation forever. The responsible thing would be to return the diary to palace officials or destroy it completely. But Helen had always struggled financially on her teacher's pension, and she couldn't help thinking about what this information might be worth to the right people. She carefully photographed several pages of the diary with her phone, focusing on the most shocking revelations. Then she began researching journalists who specialized in royal coverage, looking for someone who might be interested in purchasing such explosive material. Meanwhile, at the palace, officials had begun conducting a routine review of Margaret's files to ensure that no sensitive documents had been left behind. They found her official correspondence properly filed, and her computer password protected with all sensitive emails deleted according to protocol. Everything appeared to be in order. However, one detail troubled the palace security chief. Margaret's sister had spent an unusually long time in the apartment, and some staff members had noticed her carrying several bags when she left. While this seemed normal for someone packing up a relative's belongings, the security chief made a note to follow up if any issues arose. Helen returned to Yorkshire with the diary hidden in her suitcase, unaware that palace security cameras had captured her movements throughout her visit. She spent sleepless nights reading through Margaret's entries, torn between the potential financial gain and the moral implications of exposing the royal family's private affairs. The diary contained enough material to fuel tabloid headlines for months. There were details about which royals had drinking problems, information about plastic surgeries that had been kept secret, and most damaging of all, evidence of attempts to influence political decisions in ways that violated the monarchy's supposed political neutrality. As Helen wrestled with her decision, she didn't notice that her own phone calls and internet searches had begun to attract attention. Intelligence services routinely monitor communications for threats to national security, and certain keywords related to the royal family had triggered automated alerts. The stage was set for a scandal that would rock the British monarchy to its core. Helen Whitmore, a simple retired teacher, held in her hands the power to expose decades of carefully guarded royal secrets. The only question was whether she would have the courage to use it, and whether she would survive the consequences if she did. Helen Whitmore stared at her laptop screen, scrolling through the contact information for investigative journalists. Her hands trembled as she typed and deleted several emails, unsure how to approach someone with such sensitive material. The diary sat open on her kitchen table, its pages filled with Margaret's careful handwriting that could bring down the British monarchy. After 3 sleepless nights, Helen finally settled on contacting James Morrison, a respected journalist who had written several books about royal scandals. She sent him a carefully worded email, mentioning that she possessed information about the royal family that he might find interesting. She didn't provide specifics, only suggesting they meet in person to discuss the matter. Morrison responded within hours, his curiosity clearly piqued. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in York, where Helen nervously showed him photocopies of a few diary pages. Morrison's eyes widened as he read Margaret's entries about financial irregularities and covered-up scandals. He immediately recognized the potential impact of this material. However, Morrison was also aware of the legal dangers involved in publishing such sensitive information. He explained to Helen that they would need to verify the authenticity of the diary and ensure that publishing its contents wouldn't violate privacy laws or national security regulations. He also warned her that the royal family's legal team would likely pursue aggressive action against anyone involved in exposing these secrets. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the security review of Margaret's tenure had uncovered some troubling gaps. Her computer showed evidence of deleted files that hadn't been properly removed from the hard drive's memory. Palace IT specialists recovered fragments of emails and documents that referenced meetings and conversations not found in the official records. Prince Charles was informed about these concerns during his weekly briefing with palace officials. The possibility that Margaret might have kept unofficial records worried him greatly, especially given some of the private conversations they had shared over the years. He authorized a more thorough investigation into what materials might be missing. The investigation team discovered that Margaret's sister had indeed spent considerable time in the apartment and had left with several personal items. When they tried to contact Helen, they found that she wasn't answering her phone and had apparently left her usual residence in Yorkshire. This raised immediate red flags about the security of any sensitive information Margaret might have possessed. Helen, meanwhile, had checked into a small hotel in Manchester, afraid to stay at her own home in case palace officials came looking for her. She met with Morrison again, this time bringing the original diary. Morrison examined it carefully, noting the quality of the leather binding, the type of ink used, and Margaret's distinctive handwriting style, which he recognized from previous royal documents he had seen. To verify the diary's authenticity, Morrison contacted a handwriting expert and a former palace employee who had worked closely with Margaret. Both confirmed that the writing was genuine, and the former employee recognized specific incidents and details that only someone with Margaret's level of access could have known. As word began to spread quietly through journalistic circles that explosive royal material might soon be published. The palace's intelligence network picked up whispers of the developing story. The Queen's private secretary received a disturbing report suggesting that sensitive documents had been compromised and were now in the hands of the media. The royal family held an emergency meeting to discuss the potential crisis. Prince Charles was particularly concerned because several of the diary entries specifically mentioned his private opinions about various political and family matters. Some of his recorded comments could be interpreted as criticisms of government policy or disagreements with other family members that would damage his reputation. as the future king. The Queen authorized her legal team to begin preparing for the worst-case scenario while simultaneously launching a discreet investigation to identify the source of the leaked information. Private investigators were hired to track down Margaret's sister and determine exactly what materials she might possess. Helen found herself under increasing pressure as Morrison pushed for a decision about publication. The journalist had assembled a team of fact-checkers and legal experts who were eager to move forward with the story. But they needed Helen's cooperation to access the full diary and verify additional details. The weight of her decision was crushing Helen. The diary contained information that could destroy reputations, end careers, and potentially damage Britain's constitutional monarchy. She thought about Margaret, who had kept these secrets faithfully for 30 years, and wondered what her sister would want her to do. At the same time, Helen was acutely aware of her own financial situation. Morrison had mentioned that exclusive access to the diary could be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, enough money to secure her retirement and help her struggling daughter who was raising 2 children alone. The temptation was enormous, but so were the potential consequences. The palace investigators had traced Helen's credit card usage to Manchester and were closing in on her location. Security services were also becoming involved, concerned that the compromised information might affect national security or Britain's relationships with foreign governments. As Helen sat in her hotel room, holding the diary that had become both a blessing and a curse, she realized that her simple life as a retired teacher was about to change forever. Whether she decided to publish the secrets or return them to the palace, she would never be able to go back to the quiet anonymity she had always enjoyed. The next morning, Helen received a phone call that would force her to make the most important decision of her life. The voice on the other end was polite but firm, introducing himself as a representative of the royal family's legal team. He explained that they knew she was in possession of materials that belonged to the crown, and they wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss the situation. Helen's heart pounded as she realized that her time was running out. She had to choose between loyalty to the monarchy and the financial security that the diary's secrets could provide. The fate of the British royal family now rested in the hands of a woman who had never wanted anything more than a quiet retirement. Helen hung up the phone with shaking hands, her mind racing as she processed the conversation with the royal legal representative. They knew where she was, they knew what she had, and they wanted to meet within 24 hours. The polite but unmistakably threatening tone suggested that refusing wasn't really an option. She immediately called James Morrison, who was in London preparing the story for publication. When she explained about the phone call, Morrison's excitement was palpable. This confirmed that the palace was taking the threat seriously, which meant the diary's contents were even more explosive than they had initially thought. Morrison advised Helen to meet with the palace representatives, but to record the conversation secretly. He also urged her to hand over copies of the diary to his newspaper before the meeting, ensuring that the story could still be published, even if she was pressured into surrendering the original. That evening, Helen made copies of the most damaging diary entries and mailed them to Morrison's office using an overnight courier service. She kept the original diary with her, knowing it would be her only bargaining chip in the upcoming confrontation with the royal family's representatives. The meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon at a luxury hotel in Manchester. Helen arrived early, choosing a table in the busy restaurant where their conversation would be somewhat public, but still private enough for sensitive discussion. She activated the recording app on her phone and waited nervously for her fate to be decided. 2 men in expensive suits arrived precisely on time. The older man introduced himself as Sir William Hartley, the Queen's legal counsel, while his younger companion was identified as a security specialist. Both men were polite, but carried themselves with an authority that made Helen feel like a criminal. Sir William began by expressing the royal family's condolences for Margaret's death and acknowledging her decades of loyal service. He then gently but firmly explained that any documents or materials Margaret might have kept were considered crown property and needed to be returned. Immediately, Helen found her courage and asked what would happen if she refused. Sir William's response was carefully measured but chilling. He explained that publishing private royal correspondence could violate several laws, including the Official Secrets Act and could result in serious criminal charges. He also mentioned that the royal family was prepared to pursue civil litigation that could bankrupt her and destroy her family's financial future. However, Sir William also offered an alternative. If Helen cooperated fully and returned all materials without copying or sharing them, the royal family was prepared to offer her a substantial financial settlement in recognition of her cooperation and discretion. The amount he mentioned was enough to solve all her financial problems without the legal risks of publication. The security specialist added that they were aware of her contact with James Morrison and suggested that any cooperation with media outlets would only make her legal situation worse. They knew about the copies she had made and warned that failing to retrieve them would be considered a continuation of her criminal activity. Helen felt trapped between the palace's threats and Morrison's promises. The royal representatives seemed to know everything about her activities, including details about her financial situation and her daughter's struggles. It was clear they had done thorough research before approaching her. Meanwhile, at Morrison's newspaper office, editors were frantically preparing for what could be the biggest royal scandal in decades. They had consulted with legal experts who confirmed that while publishing the diary's contents would be risky, the public interest in exposing potential corruption and misconduct might justify the legal challenges. The newspaper's legal team was particularly interested in one diary entry that suggested Prince Charles had attempted to influence government policy regarding environmental regulations, potentially violating the constitutional principle that the monarchy must remain politically neutral. If true, this could spark a constitutional crisis. Back at the hotel, Sir William was pressing Helen for an immediate decision. He explained that the royal family's patience was limited and that legal action would begin within hours if she didn't cooperate. The security specialist showed her surveillance photos of her movements over the past few days, demonstrating the extent of their monitoring. Helen realized that her phone calls to Morrison had likely been intercepted and that the palace knew exactly what information she had shared. The sophisticated surveillance operation suggested that national security agencies were involved, making her situation even more dangerous than she had imagined. As the meeting continued, Sir William revealed more details about the potential charges Helen could face. Beyond violating the Official Secrets Act, she could be prosecuted for theft of crown property, conspiracy to commit treason, and violation of privacy laws. The combined penalties could result in decades in prison. Helen asked for time to consider the offer, but Sir William insisted that the decision had to be made immediately. He explained that every hour of delay increased the risk of publication and made it more difficult for the palace to contain the damage. The royal family needed her answer before leaving the hotel. The pressure was enormous, but Helen couldn't stop thinking about the diary's most shocking revelation. In one entry, Margaret had recorded a conversation where Prince Charles had spoken disparagingly about his mother's mental acuity and suggested that she should consider stepping down from her duties. The implications of such comments becoming public would be devastating for the monarchy. Helen also remembered entries detailing financial irregularities, including payments to silence accusers, and cover-up scandals that would embarrass the royal family. The diary contained evidence of a systematic effort to hide the truth from the British public about their royal family's behavior. As Sir William waited for her answer, Helen's phone buzzed with a text message from Morrison. He had received the copies she sent and was prepared to publish the story immediately if she gave him permission. The message included a code word that would signal him to proceed with publication. Helen looked at the two men sitting across from her, representatives of an institution that had protected its secrets for centuries through intimidation and legal threats. She thought about Margaret, who had kept these secrets faithfully but had also carefully documented them, perhaps hoping that someday the truth would come to light. The moment of decision had arrived. Helen had to choose between accepting the palace's offer and becoming complicit in covering up royal scandals, or refusing their demands and facing the consequences of exposing the truth. Whatever she decided in the next few minutes would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. Sir William leaned forward, his voice urgent as he pressed for her final answer. The security specialist checked his watch, suggesting that their patience was running out. Helen clutched her phone, knowing that a single text message could change everything. Helen's finger hovered over her phone screen as Sir William's impatient stare bore into her. The code word Margaret was typed and ready to send to Morrison, who was waiting in London with the story prepared for immediate publication. Taking a deep breath, Helen made her choice and pressed send. Within seconds, her phone rang. It was Morrison, confirming he had received the signal. Sir William noticed the exchange and demanded to know what Helen had just done. When she told him she had authorized publication of the diary's contents, the distinguished lawyer's composure cracked for the first time during their meeting. The security specialist immediately began making urgent phone calls while Sir William warned Helen that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. He explained that the royal family's legal response would be swift and devastating, designed to destroy both her and Morrison's careers while minimizing the damage to the monarchy. Helen felt a mixture of terror and relief as she watched the two men scramble to contain a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. She knew there would be consequences for her decision, but she also felt that Margaret's carefully documented evidence of royal misconduct deserved to see the light of day. Meanwhile, at Morrison's newspaper, editors were working frantically to prepare the first installment of the diary revelations for publication. The story would break online within hours, with the most shocking revelations saved for the following day's print edition. Legal experts were standing by to handle the inevitable challenges from the royal family's lawyers. The first article focused on Prince Charles's recorded comments about his mother's mental capacity and his suggestion that she should consider abdication. Morrison had carefully verified these entries against palace schedules and other evidence, confirming that the conversations Margaret described had indeed taken place on the dates she mentioned. Back at Buckingham Palace, emergency meetings were being held as officials learned about the impending publication. The Queen was briefed on the situation and reportedly remained calm, but Prince Charles was said to be furious about the invasion of his privacy and the misrepresentation of private family discussions. The palace's initial response strategy involved discrediting both the diary's authenticity and Helen's motives for selling the information. They prepared statements suggesting that Margaret had never kept personal records, and that any documents claiming to contain royal conversations were fabrications created by someone seeking financial gain. However, this strategy became more difficult when Morrison published photographs of the diary pages alongside handwriting analysis, confirming Margaret's authorship. The journalist also included testimony from former palace employees who recognized specific incidents and details that only someone with Margaret's access could have known. As news of the scandal began to spread through social media and international news outlets, the palace found itself fighting a losing battle against public curiosity and media speculation. The story was too compelling and well documented to be dismissed as simple fabrication. Helen, meanwhile, had returned to her hotel room to find it swarming with reporters who had somehow learned of her involvement in the story. Hotel security was struggling to control the crowd of journalists and photographers who wanted to speak with the woman who had exposed the royal family's secrets. Sir William called Helen's room directly, his earlier politeness replaced by barely controlled anger. He informed her that arrest warrants were being prepared and that she would be charged with multiple serious crimes. He also warned that the royal family would pursue civil litigation to recover damages and prevent further publication of the diary's contents. The legal battle began almost immediately, with palace lawyers filing emergency injunctions to prevent further publication of the diary's contents. They argued that the material was stolen property that violated the royal family's privacy rights and potentially compromised national security. Morrison's newspaper fought back with their own legal team, arguing that the public's right to know about potential royal misconduct outweighed privacy concerns. They pointed to the diary's evidence of attempts to influence government policy as justification for publication under public interest protections. The court hearings attracted massive media attention, as the British public followed every development in the unprecedented legal battle between the monarchy and the press. Public opinion was sharply divided between those who supported transparency and accountability for the royal family, and those who felt that private conversations should remain private regardless of their content. The diary's revelations about financial irregularities proved particularly damaging to the royal family's reputation. Margaret had documented payments made to suppress stories about embarrassing incidents, including substantial sums paid to prevent publication of compromising photographs and personal information about various family members. International media picked up the story, with American and European news outlets providing extensive coverage of what they characterized as the biggest royal scandal since the abdication crisis. Foreign governments privately expressed concern about the potential impact on Britain's diplomatic relationships and constitutional stability. Prince Charles attempted to address the crisis through a carefully worded statement, denying the accuracy of the diary's characterization of his conversations with the Queen. He emphasized his loyalty to his mother and his respect for the constitutional monarchy, but avoided directly addressing the specific allegations about his comments. The Queen herself remained silent about the controversy, following the royal family's traditional approach of not responding to media speculation about private matters. However, palace sources suggested that she was deeply hurt by the publication of private family conversations and concerned about the long-term damage to the monarchy's reputation. As the legal battle continued, more details from the diary were published despite the palace's attempts to prevent them. Each new revelation generated fresh headlines and public debate about the appropriate balance between royal privacy and public accountability. Helen found herself at the center of a media storm that she had never anticipated when she first discovered Margaret's diary. Death threats from royal supporters were balanced by messages of support from people who praised her courage in exposing the truth. Her quiet life as a retired teacher had become a distant memory, as she struggled to cope with constant media attention and legal pressure. The diary's most explosive revelation was yet to come, and both the palace and the media were preparing for what promised to be the most damaging disclosure yet. Helen had inadvertently triggered a constitutional crisis that would force Britain to confront fundamental questions about the role and accountability of its ancient monarchy. The most devastating revelation was published on a Thursday morning, sending shockwaves through the British establishment that would be felt for generations. Morrison's newspaper had saved the most explosive diary entry for when public attention was at its peak, ensuring maximum impact for Margaret's most carefully guarded secret. The entry described a private meeting between Prince Charles and several government ministers, where he had explicitly attempted to influence environmental policy decisions. Margaret had been present to take notes, and her diary contained detailed accounts of how Charles had threatened to publicly oppose the government if they didn't strengthen climate regulations according to his personal preferences. This revelation struck at the heart of Britain's constitutional system, which required the monarchy to remain strictly neutral in political matters. The diary provided evidence that the future king had violated this fundamental principle, potentially making his eventual reign constitutionally problematic. Within hours of publication, Parliament was in uproar. Opposition leaders demanded emergency debates about the constitutional implications of Charles's recorded behavior. Some members of Parliament suggested that his actions might disqualify him from eventually becoming king, raising questions about the line of succession that hadn't been seriously discussed in decades. The Prime Minister was forced to address the House of Commons about the allegations, confirming that the meeting described in the diary had indeed taken place. However, he characterized Charles's comments as expressions of personal opinion rather than attempts to influence policy, though this explanation satisfied few of his critics. Prince Charles released a more detailed statement acknowledging that he had met with government officials, but denying that he had attempted to improperly influence their decisions. He explained that as someone deeply concerned about environmental issues, he had simply shared his views when asked for his opinion by the ministers themselves. However, Margaret's diary painted a very different picture of the meeting. Her notes suggested that Charles had initiated the discussion and had been quite forceful in his demands for policy changes. She had recorded specific quotes that made his intentions seem far from the innocent expression of personal views that he now claimed. The constitutional crisis deepened when legal experts began debating whether Charles's actions constituted grounds for removing him from the line of succession. Some argued that his behavior demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of royal duties that made him unsuitable for the throne, while others maintained that private conversations shouldn't affect constitutional arrangements. Helen watched these developments from her hiding place in a safe house provided by Morrison's newspaper, where she was protected from the increasingly aggressive efforts by palace security to locate her. The legal charges against her were proceeding, but her lawyers argued that she was a whistleblower whose actions served the public interest. The diary's credibility was further strengthened when additional witnesses came forward to corroborate some of Margaret's entries. Former palace employees and government officials confirmed details about meetings and conversations that they had previously kept secret out of loyalty to the crown. International reaction was swift and largely negative for the royal family. Foreign governments expressed private concerns about the stability of Britain's constitutional system, while Republican movements in other Commonwealth countries seized on the revelations as evidence that monarchy was incompatible with modern democratic governance. The Queen faced increasing pressure to address the crisis directly, but her advisors were divided about the best approach. Some urged her to defend Charles publicly, while others suggested that distancing herself from his actions might be necessary to protect the monarchy's long-term survival. The financial markets reacted nervously to the constitutional uncertainty, with the British pound declining against other major currencies as investors worried about political instability. Tourism officials expressed concern about the potential impact on royal-related attractions that generated billions in revenue for the British economy. Morrison's newspaper continued to publish additional diary entries, each one adding new layers to the scandal. The revelations included details about secret payments to suppress other stories, evidence of tax avoidance schemes, and documentation of attempts to manipulate media coverage of royal activities. The palace's legal strategy began to shift as it became clear that preventing further publication was impossible. Their lawyers instead focused on limiting the damage by challenging the most serious allegations and questioning the interpretation of Margaret's notes. Prince William found himself in an increasingly difficult position as speculation grew about whether he might need to bypass his father in the line of succession. Palace sources suggested that he was deeply concerned about the long-term damage to the monarchy's reputation and was considering taking a more active role in addressing the crisis. The Archbishop of Canterbury was drawn into the controversy when diary entries revealed discussions about Charles's religious views and his potential role as head of the Church of England. Margaret had recorded conversations suggesting that Charles had privately questioned traditional church teachings, raising questions about his suitability as supreme governor of the church. Public opinion polls showed a dramatic shift in attitudes toward the royal family, with support for the monarchy falling to its lowest levels in decades. Younger Britons were particularly critical, with many expressing support for replacing the monarchy with a republican system of government. The legal proceedings against Helen became a focal point for the broader debate about royal accountability and press freedom. Her supporters organized protests outside the courthouse, arguing that she was being persecuted for exposing the truth about royal misconduct. The diary's revelations also had personal consequences for the royal family's relationships with each other. Margaret had documented private arguments and disagreements that showed the human side of the monarchy, but also revealed deep tensions that had been carefully hidden from public view. As the crisis entered its second week, it became clear that the British monarchy would never be the same. The diary that Margaret Whitmore had kept so carefully for 30 years had achieved what centuries of political opposition had failed to accomplish, forcing a fundamental reassessment of the role of royalty in modern Britain. The final act of this constitutional drama was about to unfold, as both the palace and Helen's supporters prepared for a climactic confrontation that would determine not only her personal fate, but the future of the 1,000-year-old institution she had inadvertently brought to its knees. 3 weeks after the first diary revelations were published, the crisis reached its climax when the Queen herself made an unprecedented decision that would reshape the British monarchy forever. In a televised address to the nation, she announced that she was taking personal responsibility for the constitutional chaos that had engulfed her family. The Queen's speech was carefully crafted to acknowledge the seriousness of the allegations against Prince Charles while defending the institution of monarchy itself. She announced the establishment of a formal review of royal protocols and promised new transparency measures that would prevent similar scandals in the future. Most shocking of all, the Queen revealed that she had personally reviewed Margaret's diary and found that many of the entries accurately reflected conversations and events that had occurred exactly as described. This admission destroyed the palace's previous strategy of questioning the diary's authenticity and forced a complete reassessment of the royal family's public position. Prince Charles was conspicuously absent from the Queen's address, leading to immediate speculation about his future role in the monarchy. Palace sources later confirmed that he had agreed to step back from all official duties while the constitutional review was conducted, effectively removing him from active royal service indefinitely. The dramatic developments vindicated Helen's decision to expose the diary's contents, but her personal situation remained precarious. The criminal charges against her were proceeding despite growing public support for her actions, and the royal family's civil lawsuit seeking financial damages was still pending. Morrison's newspaper had become the center of an international media empire built around the royal scandal, with their exclusive access to the diary generating enormous profits from syndication deals with news outlets worldwide. However, they also faced their own legal challenges as the palace pursued every available avenue to limit the damage from ongoing revelations. The constitutional review announced by the Queen was headed by a distinguished panel of legal experts, historians, and constitutional scholars who were tasked with examining not only Charles's specific actions, but the broader question of royal accountability in a democratic society. Parliamentary debates about the monarchy's future became increasingly heated as representatives grappled with fundamental questions about the role of hereditary privilege in modern Britain. Some members of Parliament called for immediate abolition of the monarchy, while others argued for reforms that would preserve the institution while limiting its power. The international implications of the crisis continued to grow as Commonwealth countries reconsidered their relationships with the British Crown. Several nations began formal discussions about becoming republics, citing the constitutional chaos in Britain as evidence that monarchy was an outdated form of government. Helen emerged from hiding to testify before the Constitutional Review panel, where she was treated as a key witness rather than a criminal. Her testimony about discovering the diary and her decision to make its contents public was broadcast live, transforming her from a figure of controversy into a symbol of ordinary citizens holding powerful institutions accountable. The diary's final secrets were revealed during Helen's testimony, including entries that showed how the royal family had systematically concealed information from Parliament and the public about their political activities. Margaret had documented a pattern of constitutional violations that went far beyond Charles's individual actions. Prince William was forced to address the crisis publicly when he gave his first major interview since the scandal began. He acknowledged that the monarchy needed fundamental reforms to survive in the modern world and suggested that his generation of royals understood the need for greater transparency and accountability. The legal proceedings against Helen took an unexpected turn when her defense team argued that she was protected by whistleblower legislation designed to shield people who expose wrongdoing in the public interest. The case became a test of whether traditional ideas about royal privilege could withstand modern concepts of governmental accountability. Margaret's diary was eventually donated to the British National Archives, where it would be preserved for future historians studying this pivotal moment in constitutional history. The leather-bound journal that had been hidden behind false books in a Kensington palace apartment had become one of the most important historical documents of the 21st century. The long-term consequences of the diary scandal reshaped British society in ways that nobody had anticipated. When Helen first discovered Margaret's secret, public attitudes toward authority and privilege were permanently changed, with citizens becoming far more skeptical of claims that certain information needed to remain secret for the public good. A year after the crisis began, a much-reduced monarchy emerged from the Constitutional Review with strictly limited powers and unprecedented transparency requirements. Charles had formally renounced his claim to the throne, clearing the way for William to eventually become king under a new constitutional framework that emphasized accountability over tradition. Helen received a royal pardon that cleared her of all criminal charges, and she used the money from a book deal about her experiences to establish a foundation supporting government transparency. She never regretted her decision to expose Margaret's diary, even though it had cost her the quiet retirement she had originally sought. The palace apartment where Margaret had kept her diary was converted into a museum exhibition about royal history and constitutional development. Visitors could see the bookshelf, where the diary had been hidden, and learn about how one woman's careful documentation of royal secrets had changed Britain forever. The British monarchy survived the crisis, but it emerged as a fundamentally different institution than it had been before Margaret's diary came to light. The idea that royal conversations and actions were automatically protected from public scrutiny had been permanently shattered, replaced by a new understanding that democratic societies required transparency, even from their most traditional institutions. Helen often wondered what Margaret would have thought about the chaos that followed the discovery of her diary. Perhaps Margaret had always intended for these secrets to eventually be revealed, carefully preserving the evidence until someone with the courage to use it came along. In any case, her 30 years of faithful service to the crown had ultimately served the cause of democratic accountability in ways that she never could have imagined. The diary that had exposed royal secrets became a symbol of the power that ordinary citizens possessed to hold their leaders accountable, proving that even the most carefully guarded secrets of the most powerful institutions could not remain hidden forever when someone was brave enough to bring them into the light.